doing this for?
Half hour. Welcome to Focus on the Candidates. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Mark Dunlea, who ran for New York State Comptroller 3 years ago on the green ticket. And we're going to talk about Tom DiNapoli and the people that are urging him to divest from bonds for Israel. So, Mark, what's going on with that? How long have we been invested in bonds for Israel?
Well, presumably decades. I do know that since October 7th, the Tom DiNapoli, the Common Retirement Fund, has apparently added on about $100 million to our bond investments in Israel, bringing the total, according to the Break the Bonds campaign, to about $352 million. But I do know that back in 1998, when the Green Party ran its first set of statewide candidates, our candidate that year for state controller, Howie Hawkins, one of his big things was to divest from the Israeli bonds. And so that was back in 1998. Howie had been very active, as many other people were, with the anti-apartheid campaign as a college student up at Dartmouth College. And so he articulated, divesting from Israel as part of that. And then later, of course, we had the boycott, divest, and sanction movement came together to begin to urge governments, churches, unions to take actions against Israel because of its treatment of the Palestinian people as apartheid, similar to what in South Africa. And then, of course, since Hamas's attack on October 7th, which was a terrorist attack and should be condemned, unfortunately, Israel has responded by committing genocide against the people of Gaza, and that has certainly elevated the demand that governments stop, supporting Israel.
Would you say that a lot of the states are invested in bonds for Israel?
My guess is yes. Though I'm personally, I've been more focused on New York State. One of the things that Tom DiNapoli argues is that, as he has argued with his investments in oil and gas funds, is that the Israeli bonds, provide a, stable level of dividends. And so that's why they added to their portfolio to have a stable interest rate. One of the things about the Israeli bonds, unlike other bonds, is that you're not allowed to sell or buy Israel bonds except from Israel. And so once the bonds are issued, there's no secondary market. And if it's a 5-year bond, 10-year bond, you have to wait till that bond expires. You can't, sort of sell it. That's pretty unusual for bonds. Usually there's a secondary market. So if you decide, hey, their interest rate isn't really good any longer, or I feel that the risk is too high. When you engage in wars on a constant basis, you begin to say, well, maybe this government, may not be doing too well in 4 or 5 years. I'd like to, maybe protect the fund by, selling some of the bonds. You can't do that with Israel. And one of the things about DiNapoli, which he's been, to be honest, less than honest. I've talked to Tom myself a couple of times in the last few months about the Israeli bonds, and I've heard him speak about it as well. And he makes the argument that, well, we just do it because it's a good financial investment, and we never make decisions, based on social policies. That general statement is untrue. They've several times have made divestment or investment decisions based on social policy, not on the financial wisdom of the investment. But in particular, I just was reading this morning a press release that he put out on October 13th, 2023, a week after the October 7th, in which he made it very clear that a main motivation, in this case was only a $20 million increase, was to support the Israeli government politically, not because of the wisdom of the financial investment. And according to, the Break the Bonds campaign, he has invested $100 million since October 7th, 2023 in Israeli bonds. And while he may now be saying, oh, just a good investment, he made it very clear early on in his statements he was doing it to support the Israeli government against the people of Palestine.
When you ran against him 3 years ago,
It was actually 7 years ago. Time really flies.
oh, it was 7 years ago. 2 cycles ago, then.
2 cycles ago. I did not run in the last cycle.
Okay, so can you tell us what you were running on back then?
Well, my main focus in when I ran was on the divestment from fossil fuels,
Okay.
and that is what I had helped 350 New York City in particular, 350 OIG internationally. That's the group that Bill McKibben, climate activist, has started. And the state had somewhere 12, $13 billion invested in fossil fuels. And we had drafted legislation to get DiNapoli to divest from fossil fuels. As you may remember, Tom DiNapoli was not initially elected to state controller. He was appointed as a state controller by the New York State Legislature. He was an assembly member because Alan Hevensey, who had literally just been reelected, resigned over various. He basically allowed his state paid driver to drive his wife to doctor's appointment, which to me honestly was not exactly the worst scandal in New York State political history. He subsequently did some other things that were kind of bad. But in any case, he resigned, and DiNapoli, as an assembly member, was appointed by the legislature. And so we knew there was always going to be difficult to get the legislature to actually pass legislation to require DiNapoli to divest, because he was their guy. They had literally been the ones that appointed to him. But we thought if we could get 50 legislators to sponsor legislation calling upon him to divest. And unlike New York City's pension funds, the state controller is the sole trustee, so he makes all the decisions. We thought if we get 50 legislators to co-sponsor legislation, he would get the message and would divest. The reality is we got well over 100, and he still wasn't divested. And so we decided to run against him. I did also, because the Green Party had, initially raised this in 1998, we did raise the issue of divesting from Israel as well. That was not as much. It was not as major factor as the divestment, from the campaigns. And there were other issues. I really thought that the state controller should be more aggressive in being a watchdog for the state's fiscal situation, that he should stand up and complain about some of the bad decisions that they made, that he should be willing to do evaluations of various proposals. For instance, with single payer healthcare, save the state billions of dollars, which in my opinion it would, but it'd be good if he did an independent study, come up with that number. And I thought the state controller should in fact be a more vocal voice on the state's tax policy, where DiNapoli largely does not engage much with the state legislature, except on a couple of things directly related to his office. And reality, while most people think that Tom DiNapoli is the nicest guy in Albany, the one guy who did not think Tom DiNapoli was nice was Andrew Cuomo, the governor, and he had taken some state contracts away from controller oversight, partly because Cuomo was being, corrupt. And you may remember that his chief development person was convicted for fraud with respect to the $1 billion Buffalo billion is what they called it. I believe giving money to Elon Musk and others out there, and that was a rigged bid, and that was an issue because that contract previously would have been overseen by the state controller, but Cuomo, right before he rigged the bid, had removed the controller from oversight of those particular type of projects. So it was also clean government, open government, but divestment was a big issue, mainly from the fossil fuels, but also from the Israeli bonds.
So have we divested from fossil fuels?
Partially. Maybe about a year after the election, Senator Liz Kruger, a wonderful advocate in the legislature, and she'd been the main sponsor of the divestment bill. And at that point, pretty much sure we had a majority of the senators in the Senate sponsoring the bill, and we were maybe 2 or 3 short of having a majority of the assembly members sponsoring the bill. And if you just looked at the Democrats, because the legislature is very partisan and Democrats pay no attention to the Republicans these days, an overwhelming majority of the Democrats in both houses were sponsoring the divestment bill. And so what Kruger did was she went to Tom DiNapoli and said, if you agree to follow the process that the New York City controller has agreed to on divestment, I will withdraw the bill. And basically, the New York City controller had divested. And what the New York City controller did to try to legally protect himself from, fiduciary responsibility was that he would review the climate and financial record of the various sectors of the fossil fuel industry. And if they were not good, he would divest. And I know, for instance, in New York State, if we had divested at the point when Tom DiNapoli first became controller, and this is 5 or 6 years ago, so numbers have changed, the state would have had $22 billion more in the state pension fund. So the failure to divest, it cost the state $22 billion. But, I mean, these guys like to argue they're making decisions solely on financial reasons, and that's totally unrealistic because the reality of the last decade, the fossil fuel industry has been the worst performing sector in the on Wall Street. In many years, it loses money. In some years, when the stocks are really, bounding through the roof, they might get 4 or 5%, but that's when the rest of the stock market may be getting 15, 20%. So it was sort of a bad thing. So in any case, he did follow through in that process. He had appointed his own committee to look at the issue of investments. They had come back and said, you must immediately, today, divest from coal because that's a terrible investment. Get out of that as soon as possible. So he took another year, but he eventually divested from coal. And he did divest from shale oil and some other thing. But then the big one was he decided to look at the big oil and gas companies. And this took place on Valentine's Day, 2024. And he came back and said, ExxonMobil is really bad on climate. So we're going to dump them. But the other big ones like Shell and Occidental and BP, they've changed and they're good. So we're not going to divest from the 7 of the largest oil and gas companies. Oh, and on Exxon, yes, they're bad. So I have about 550 million, maybe $600 million invested in Exxon. I'm only going to divest 50 million of that. That 50 million is what I directly decided to invest. The other 500 million, half a billion, That's what's known as we put that money through an index fund. So that's a passive investment. And so I'm not going to divest from that $500 million because, oh, people would be really upset if I didn't stay with that index. And I would say, Tom, no one except the Wall Street brokers who you're paying money to handle the investment knows that you're playing index funds. No one in the world is going to be concerned if you divest from Exxon because you think it's a bad investment. But in any case, he did not do that. And in fact, we're about to release a report tomorrow, Tuesday, um, even a year and a half ago. I mean, we cited various other groups, including the woman who had been the lead negotiator for the United Nations in the Paris Climate Accords, and just a week before DiNapoli decided that these oil and gas companies were good on the climate, she had come out and said these companies are not only bad, but they're getting worse. And there were a number of similar studies that came out. And so he did not divest from them. We put out tomorrow a report that basically groups like Carbon Tractors and others said not only are they bad, but they're getting worse. And that these companies are been increasing their investment in fossil fuels. They're putting more money to try and find new fossil fuel reserves. And I've asked Tom, hey, Tom, why won't you hold a public hearing and allow the climate scientists and allow the financial investors to come in and testify about the climate record of these companies? Oh, that would just be an opportunity for the climate groups to have a performance. I don't want anything public like that. If you want to send me studies, I'll read the studies, but I don't want nothing in public where you guys just can come out and trash the oil and gas companies. So that's pretty disappointing. We hope he changes his mind, but he just seems committed to keeping money in the oil and gas companies, even though it is costing not only the pension owners, but really the taxpayers. New York is the only state in the country which has a constitutional provision that public pension funds are treated as a contractual obligation. And so, unlike the other 49 states, if the state pension funds has any problems meeting its financial obligations to pension holders, and of course we want to pay the pension holders off, and my wife's a pension holder, we get money out of that. Um, Taxpayers are on the hook. They have to make up the difference. So that we're the only state that has that constitutional requirement. It's one of the reasons why the labor unions always oppose having a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution, despite how bad the Constitution is, because they want to ensure that protection of the public pension funds continue. So it's really the taxpayers who are being hurt by Tom DiNapoli. It's not the pension fund, retirees, because they are protected. And I will say that New York State actually is one of the worst performing pensions among the state public pensions in the country. It's not terrible, but its rate of return is much lower, not much lower. It's lower than the other pension funds. People, well, wait a moment, isn't New York State pension fund rated high? It is rated high because we have enough money in our pension funds to cover future obligations. And that's really important, and the state deserves credit for that. But in terms of its rate of return on its investment, New York is at the bottom of the pile in terms of the large public pension funds in the United States.
So, given you just outlined what happened with the, fossil fuel industry, would it be safe to say that DiNapoli is not going to divest from Israel anytime soon?
That is certainly true. I think there's more chance he might divest from the fossil fuel, but he's not receiving any real, community activists, Jewish Voice of Peace, a lot of church groups, peace groups are pushing him to divest. But so far, the big institutions, the unions have not weighed in. Now, one factor is that he, for the first time in recent memory, is being challenged in the Democratic primary by two individuals. At least one of us has raised a fair amount of money, and the other one is a former state legislator from Kansas who moved to New York maybe a decade ago. So they have some political, wherewithal. At least one of them, I forget his first name is Raj, forget his last name. But he has been publicly supportive of divestment from fossil fuels. The other one used to work for Elliot Spitzer. He has contacted me for information about divestment from fossil fuels. So I expect he'll come out in favor of that as well. But I've not heard either one of those two say anything about the Israeli bonds. They might have, but I've not yet, heard it. But a lot of people, certainly among Democrats, a majority of Democrats believe that Israel has been unconscionable in their genocide. Now, of course, we are in this midst of a so-called ceasefire. Israel has broken that ceasefire every single day and has killed dozens of Palestinians, including many children and families, since the ceasefire started. So, does that ceasefire hold? If the ceasefire holds, I think the pressure for Israel to divest will be reduced. Certainly, peace groups will continue, but the public pressure will be less. If the ceasefire, falls apart and the horrific level of genocides continue, I think there'll be more, public pressure, especially if the opponents to DiNapoli have the courage, to raise it. Fight in Israel, opposing the Israeli government, not the people of Israel, certainly not being anti-Semitic, but the Israeli government, especially not Netanyahu, who many people believe is not only, but primarily fighting this genocide because otherwise his corruption, which he's lost court cases on, would drive him, from office. You know, but you're seeing in New York, Mondami, who's been quite vocal in his support for Palestine, even a majority of Jewish voters in New York are voting for Mondami for mayor, and that is changing. And so, but that's going to change the dynamics for Tom DiNapoli. Who can tell?
Do you think that this is a slippery slope, I think? Do you think that APEC contributions have a factor in all this?
I don't know how much APAC is paid to Tom DiNapoli. I don't know if you have data on that. It certainly it has been a factor uh, with, because APAC, probably for the most part hasn't viewed a state controller as being, essential to the fight to, protect Israel and stuff like that. Whether that's been changing recently, since, the bond has become a big issue, that might be a big case. APAC certainly has a tremendous impact on politicians. They certainly bought a lot of politicians in Congress. Um, I've not heard as much data about their involvement in New York State. Certainly, our present governor has been overwhelmingly very supportive of IDF despite its genocide. The previous governor, Andrew Cuomo, was the same way. But things are changing. I'm a person. I grew up in a household that said, there was sort of, two major political issues in my family. My family were, more liberal. One was a public school teacher, one was a social worker. But the two things that we grew up with as a family was strong support for civil rights and then strong support for Israel rights to exist. And I'm still someone who actually views myself as being pro-Israel in terms of wanting to protect the people of Israel because, anti-Semitism is real. The Holocaust, of course, is obviously tremendously real. And Israel, has needed protection. But over the decades, I've also come to realize that, the Palestinians were not in any way responsible for the Holocaust. and they need protection as well from the Israeli government, and that is changing. Unfortunately, money talks in politics. AIPAC has been able to spend a lot of money, even though the public opinion polls have increasingly, especially for the Democrats, swung against the IDF, not so much against Israel, but against the IDF. Um, but so far, the political leadership at the top hasn't changed. But, the surprising result in the mayoral primary in New York City for Mandami, with his pro-Palestinian position, will now convince people at the state level to begin to modify the position. When we'll see. I remember that, politicians at state capitol were falling over themselves to attack people for promoting the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanctions. And, we should rightfully condemn violence against civilians. BDS was an effort to use nonviolence to change. And yet politicians were passing laws trying to ban student groups that supported, BDS from college campuses, especially CUNY and SUNY. And that was just 5 years ago. Whether they have modified their position, be interesting, to see. But certainly a lot of politicians supported the crackdown, in places like Columbia, when students were protesting.
So DiNapoli's in the primary, and that's Democrat. Would you consider running again against the DiNapoli as a Green?
I am too old. We need younger people. But unfortunately, one of the things that Cuomo did was literally in the middle of COVID, he changed the ballot access laws for state
Yeah.
level parties. Um, New York State now has the most stringent ballot access laws for state level third parties in the world. I am told there is a city government in Moscow that has almost as restrictive as New York State does. So it is virtually impossible for, unless you're a fusion candidate like the Working Families Party or the Conservative Party, who just at the state level, they just cross endorse whoever the Democrats put up for governor, regardless of how much they oppose them. The Working Families Party has always said, we oppose Cuomo. We hate Cuomo. Vote for Cuomo. Vote for Cuomo and Working Families Party line because we need our votes to keep our ballot line. So the Greens are not going to be able to run anybody against Tom DiNapoli at this point, unless somehow democracy breaks out at the New York State Capitol and the Democrats say, we were wrong to go along with Cuomo. We should go back to the ballot access laws that existed. In the last election was the first time in, I think, a century that there was not an independent third party candidate on the ballot for governor in New York State.
Mm. So, if I invite you back on, would you come back on and talk about this issue? Because I think it's very important.
Certainly, but there's certainly other people in the Green Party who I'm not a Green Party spokesperson, these days. I still
Yes,
support.
but you might not be a spokesman, but you ran for New York State Controller.
Yeah, I can be one of the people who can talk. But
Okay, great.
and I think one of the other, electoral reforms, a little bit off topic, but people are pushing pretty hardly is ranked choice voting, which they have done in New York City, but only for the primaries, not for the general election. It'd be very interesting. There was so much maneuvering during the recent New York City mayoral primary, and Brad Lander and Mandami came out together in a joint ticket, so to speak. But we're not seeing that in the general election. But there's a lot of movement around the state, and including in the city of Albany at the moment, to try to push, ranked choice voting as electoral reform. And that's where you rank candidates in order of preference, and no one wins unless they get 50% of the vote. And if no one on the first ballot gets 50% of the vote, you discard the lowest ranking vote, the lowest ranking candidate, and then their voter's second choice, or redistribute it until somebody gets 50% of the vote. And it means that you don't elect anybody unless they have at least some level of majority support.
Mark, I look forward to talking with you again. This has been very interesting. So you've been listening to Mark Dunlea, who was a candidate for New York State Comptroller 2 cycles ago. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Focus on the Candidates. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thanks, Mark. Have a good day also.
Thank you, Cynthia.